There are many variants of the AT-AT or all-terrain armoured transport series. Some good, some bad, some ugly. Today I'm going to go through all of them, their strengths, their weaknesses, and in many cases their utter pointlessness. This is not a video of every AT variant, just vehicles that are inspired by or use the same basic design as the original AT-AT, seen in The Empire Strikes Back. The AT-AT is probably the most recognisable vehicle in all of Star Wars. Lightly armed and reasonably well armoured, it was the vehicular backbone of the Imperial Army, and its basic design allowed for many variants, which we will shortly visit. The AT-AT could carry 40 passengers and 5 speeder bikes. This perfectly shows that the Walker was more of a transport geared towards anti-insurgency rather than a weapons platform designed for open warfare. The Empire did have such vehicles, but in much fewer numbers. The AT-AT was a crucial weapon in the Empire's armory and a perfect example of the Tarkin Doctrine. Identical and mass-produced machinery, which meant that wherever you were in the galaxy, you knew the Empire were in charge. People often argue that the Empire should have continued the production and use of the AT-TE instead of moving to the AT-AT, but this argument neglects the idea that the Empire is trying to stop conflict from starting rather than fighting it, and so in that role I think it does a very good job. The all-terrain armoured heavy transport is not Imperial, but it fits best here. It was used by Darth Krayt's Galactic Empire, an empire existing from 130 to 138 ABY. This was about 125 years after the fall of the Galactic Empire. Most notably, it has much more weaponry with side-facing and heavy top-mounted cannons. It has a crew of 5, could hold 8 speeder bikes and 3 AT RCTs. I imagine space would be a luxury aboard the Walker. As with the AT-AT, it was much more of a troop transport than main battle tank, but it shows an interesting shift away from previous mass-produced lightly armed vehicles of the Galactic Empire towards more specialised transports, more reminiscent of the Walkers seen during the Clone Wars. The AT-IC does exactly what it says on the tin. Is that a phrase Americans use? Anyways, it is literally just an ion cannon bolted to the back of an AT-AT. Now, ignoring the statistics about this Walker, I'm really struggling to find a scenario in which this would be useful at all. Admittedly, they did not mass produce these, they were kept for very specific and important base defences. But even then, of all the things to stick on the back of a ground walker, you choose an ion cannon. Not only do they take up a huge amount of power, but they're almost always used against larger ships to damage and disable shields and electronics. There just isn't much need for them on a mobile walker platform, because they're not very effective against starfighters. So despite the flaws of the idea, I do like how potential future problems are being accounted for, instead of just relying on their existing fleet of walkers. But on the other hand, let's be honest, I think this AT-AT should have stayed on the drawing board. Yes, this is different to the all-terrain armoured heavy transport, and it's actually what it sounds like, a beefed up version of the classic AT-AT. It has much more heavy duty armour and more powerful energy intensive weaponry. I think it's actually a very good idea to have a more fortified version of the AT-AT, because even though most of the time the standard version will be enough to ensure that people don't rebel against the Empire, sometimes you need some extra muscle to take on the more armoured opponents and structures. Why does there always have to be a shadow version of everything in Star Wars? I know it sounds cool, but just listen to the Wikipedia description. The Shadow AT-AT was created solely for the purpose of intimidating enemy forces rather than performing stealth operations. Well, then what is the point in it? It's literally the exact same except for some black paint and red windows. Moving on. It would seem the Imperial engineers forgot the meaning of the phrase all-terrain. The Dune Walker was essentially an AT-AT with air conditioning, so I think we should just call it the AT-AC. You might think I'm joking, but no, the Dune Walker was literally just an AT-AT with a Sinar Z23 heat dissipation unit. Now, I would assume that if it's called the Dune Walker, it would have some modifications for walking over soft sandy dunes, but no, the Walker had no such modifications. And to top that off, the AC unit was apparently so big and energy intensive that it required the removal of weapon systems. This is a Walker with its own power reactor, yet AC takes up an entire compartment. Now, ignoring the whole all-terrain aspect, you might think that this submarine is a good use of spare AT-AT parts, but you'd be wrong. For some reason, it uses repulsor lifts as opposed to a propeller, which means it's technically actually all-terrain, but no, they decided they would only use it underwater. Whose idea was that? And I guess the engineers were smoking some of Kashyyyk's finest, because it has the midsection of an AT-TE, or bendy bus, without any of the benefits. It instead acts as a giant marker of shoot here. As far as we know, it was only seen notably once during the Galactic Civil War, where the rebels essentially saw it as a minor inconvenience. I'm really struggling to figure out what the Imperial engineers were thinking. Finally, a Walker with a purpose. The cargo transport variant of the AT-AT is slightly larger and has weaker armour, although this Walker was not meant for open warfare at all. model. It has the same basic weapons as the AT-AT, but instead of the troop transport capacity in the hull, it has a magnetically sealed cargo container. This Imperial cargo transport system was precisely designed to ensure that these cargo units could be transferred from large cargo ships to shuttles to the AT-ACT. Although, as seen in Rogue One, they are very vulnerable to any form of heavy laser fire, the First Order's version of the AT-AT was actually more of a transport than the Empire's AT-AT. With fewer weapons consisting of a single pair of laser cannons, it was always deployed alongside the AT-M6, so the smaller transport didn't really need to have any firepower. And last but not least, the First Order's main combat vehicle, the AT-M6. Despite its clunky design, which, yes, was supposed to look like a gorilla.
And Kevin Jenkins and I designing a new walker was kind of our white whale. There's actually a power that this thing projects by being on its knuckles and having this forward lunge, being on its knuckles.
What a bunch of idiots.
It has a lot of very powerful weapons, including dual heavy laser cannons, anti-ship cannons, and the Mega Caliber 6 turbo laser cannon, from which the Walker gets its name. This weapon was so power intensive that it required its own dedicated power plant. It could only carry 12 passengers, but as we discussed with the First Order's AT-AT, it could offload that responsibility of troop transport to its smaller counterpart. And that is every AT-AT, I hope. What variant is your favourite? And do you think there are any gaps in the capabilities of these walkers? Thank you very much for watching.